Hello everyone and welcome to GeoTab Online Training. This is Carrie Carter and today's session is on advanced reports with our very own Miss Angie. Angie is going to take us through some advanced reports. This is part 3 of 3, so we do have the other ones that are already posted on my admin as well as on our website. If you need to catch up on those later, you can do that. This is going to take us deep into the weeds with Excel. And with that, Angie, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Carrie. Welcome everybody to part 3 of 3 for the advanced reports. So today what we're going to actually go over is pivot tables. What is a pivot table? How can we use a pivot table? Also in conjunction with that, using pivot charts as well. Then we're actually going to move from pivot tables over to actually a little bit more with pivot tables on calculated fields, which is definitely a little bit more of an advanced feature within Excel. And then from there, very high-level cover over macros. I think we could probably do that in an entire session, but I'll show you kind of how to record a macro, how you can actually set it to run when a report is opened. And then I'll actually go through one of the reports that we actually have on our marketplace that was just recently added, and it's actually leveraging the URLs within my GeoTab and actually using those in an Excel report. So we're going to look at an exceptions report and how to actually click on a link that will bring you into my GeoTab to view the trips, which is pretty cool stuff. And then finally, after that, I'm just going to cover over a couple of resources that I tend to use when I'm looking up stuff, because I still don't know everything in Excel. I'm still learning. So I always say Google's my best friend. I tend to Google everything, but there are some really good sites to take a look at whenever you get those Google results. So with that, I'm actually just going to quickly talk over some of the features and really what a pivot table is used for. So in part 1, I did mention kind of the basics on how our reports are built. So we have those 3 tabs. We have a data tab, a report tab, and a summary tab. So the summary tab is actually where the pivot table is housed in a report. Every single My GeoTab report that we have in the system by default has a summary tab, so the pivot table is already set up for you. Now one thing to remember is that our pivot tables are built from the all data named range, and I did cover this before, but let me actually just show you what I'm talking about. So I'm going to do most of the presentation in Excel today. So this is just an exceptions detailed report. What we've done with all of our reports is we've created a named range called all data, and really what that does is it highlights, as you would imagine, all of the data within the report tab. So you can see what the all data named range looks like by going up. If you go above the letter A here, if you can see my mouse, it's got a name box that's telling me the cell that I'm currently selected on, which is E6, and there's a little drop down. So if I click on the drop down, you can see we've got all data. So this is already a predefined name range that we have built into the report. If I click on it, it's just going to show me what is included in all data. So it's highlighting every single column that we have and every single row all the way down to the bottom of the data. Now, the great thing about this is that it's kind of dynamic. So as the reports are generated, you're going to get more lines of data or less lines of data. The all data named range will build and shrink with that. And that's what we recommend to build a pivot table from. There have been times where you may need to build a second pivot table than one on top of the one that's actually built into the report. And if you build a new pivot table and you actually just highlight maybe a certain section, or you highlight all of the data here, and then if I were to just go to Insert Pivot Table, if I keep the range as A9 to O27, what's going to happen is if more data gets added to this report, I'm not going to see that in the pivot table because I've set it so that it's only looking from A9 to O27. So anything from 28 down is not going to be included in the report. So that's why we recommend when you're building a pivot table, don't highlight it. You can actually, let me just show you, you can click on anywhere. It doesn't matter, any one of the columns here you can click on, and you can go to Insert and go to Pivot Table, And it's going to highlight automatically all of the data for you. And then I'm actually just going to delete that table range, and I'm just going to type in all data. You don't have to have the capitals in there like I have. I'm just used to doing it that way. It can be all lowercase. It knows that it is a named range in the report. Now, you do have the option to have this pivot table live in the existing worksheet if you want to, or you can have it just create a new worksheet with the pivot table on there. Most of the time that's what you're going to want to do, but if you do want to build it in an existing worksheet, you can absolutely do that and select the cell where you want it to go. So if I click OK, just to show you an example, here's where the pivot table is. It's now created a new sheet 1, and now I've got all of the data in there, and because it's built with that all data named range, anytime I run this report now, it's going to include all of the data no matter what. Now I don't actually want to use this one. I'm just going to delete this just because I just wanted to show you how to create it. I'm not going to click on the summary tab here. So let me actually just take off a couple of things here. Okay, so the summary tab already has a pivot table on here, and you can see right now it's just including the devices. So I want to cover a little bit of kind of why we have pivot tables, what are the features and benefits of using these. As you can see on the report tab, we have a lot of data, but to really slice and dice it, or filter for certain rules, or to subtotal for certain things, it's not as easy on the report tab. I can sort, maybe I could filter in here, but I could really only do that one at a time, but I'm not really getting a true visual of the data. And that's really the reason why pivot tables exist, is to be able to easily visualize the data, and it allows you to trend or group data based on certain criteria. So you could group it by maybe events per hour, or if you use the trending feature within My Geo tab, you could show your trending by day, week, or month as well. It also allows you to be able to subtotal and aggregate numeric data. You can summarize data by categories and subcategories, and you can create custom calculations and formulas. The other great thing is that it gives you the ability to move rows to columns or columns to rows, to see different summaries of the source data, and that's called pivoting, really. And then also, I kind of mentioned this, it allows you to be able to filter, sort, you can apply conditional formatting to the most useful and interesting subset of data to really enable you to focus on the information that you want. And then finally, I think one of the main features here is really just to allow you to present, some precise data to be able to graph on and really just show just the information that you're looking for. The next thing that I actually want to cover is how this all kind of works. Now, when you click on a pivot table, you may see this pivot chart fields on the side here. Now, if you're using an older version of Excel, it may be in a pop-up window, but it's going to be the same information. It just may look a little bit differently. So I do have the newer version of Excel, but don't be alarmed. It's not going to be too far off if you have an older version. Okay, so to get this pivot chart fields, you can actually hide it or show it. There's a couple of ways that you can do that. You can right-click anywhere on this table, and you can see the table is highlighted in this blue box here. I can right-click anywhere, and at the very bottom of my list here, I have Hide Field List. So I can click on there, and then it goes away. Now, whenever I'm making a custom report for a customer, I tend to hide that because if anyone's not too familiar with pivot tables, they may not understand what that window is there for, and they may start moving things around, and it affects the outcome of the report. But when I'm building it, I absolutely need to show the field list. So I'm going to right-click back again and click on Show Field List. Now, I could also go up to, you can see when I click on the pivot table in kind of a pinky purple color up there, I've got something that says Pivot Table Tools. And I've got an Analyze tab and a Design tab. Now if I click away from the pivot table, you'll see that that actually disappears. So let me just click back on there. And if I click on Analyze, this is where I can also show or hide the field list. And there are a couple of other things as well. Now, one thing I want to touch on is these regions over here that you see at the bottom of the field list. So you can see we have them labeled as filters, columns, rows, and values. So it's pretty self-explanatory if you know how a table is structured. So right now I chose device and I want them to show up as rows. So they're down in the rows section. I could, if I wanted to have them show up in the columns, I could simply just click on the existing device underneath rows and just move it into the columns section. So you can see now they're set up as columns. Now I can also, let's see if let's take a look at maybe just the total distance driven. This is, actually let's look at, sure. This is the total distance driven while they were breaking some exceptions. You can see that it's automatically, as soon as I checked on distance, it moved it down into the values region because it knows that the information within the distance column on the report tab is values, so it already knows that that's where it needs to go. So Excel's pretty smart that way. It will move it down there. Sometimes you may see that it doesn't sum the information. It will show it as a count, and that may happen if the information in the data source column from the report tab is not actually formatted as a value. If it's not, then it will come up as a count of. Now we can easily change that. You can see right now it does say sum of, which is great, but maybe I want to change the format. You can see it's got a lot of numbers there that I don't really want. I want it to be nice and clean and concise. So I can actually just click on sum of distance to, just a left click, and I can go to value field settings. Now what this is going to let me do is I can choose to show the data as a count, maybe an average distance, the maximum distance that they drove, the minimum. You may want to use max and min for something like the speed that they drove or something along those lines. So if you're looking at maybe a trips report for a week's worth, we know that we get the max speed that they drove per trip, but maybe you want the max speed for the day. So you could do the max of the speed or just the max of the speed for the whole time frame. Now what I can also do is go to my number format. So this is where I can just format how this looks. So I just click on number format, and it's just the basic formatting cells. Right now I just want it to be a number, and I'm okay with it just being 2 decimal places. Maybe if the numbers are larger than 1,000, I want a comma in there just to make it visually easier to read. And then I can click on OK. Now the other thing I can do before I click on OK here is I can change the name. So right now it's just saying sum of distance to. I can actually change that to just say total distance driven, or whichever I like. And click OK. And now you can see it changed the name where it says total distance driven here, and I've got my number format 0.33. It's the 2 decimal places, which is what I wanted. A couple of things here that I tend to change just to make it easier to read, because you can see it says, you know, I've got the header of device and total over here, but then I've got total distance driven up here. It's not really that easy to read. So what I can do is go into the options of the entire pivot table itself. So to do that, I can click on the pivot table, and I'll right click, and I'm going to go to pivot table options. A couple of things that I tend to do, which I've covered in other sessions, is I usually uncheck where it says auto fit column widths on update. The reason why I do that is you can see the information outside of the pivot table, which is in rows 3 to 7. The dates have become so small that you can't read them, so Excel replaces them with those hash symbols. And the reason why it's doing that is because the column in the pivot table itself is being auto-fitted to whatever data is in that column. So it's not taking into consideration the information outside of the pivot table. So it's making it so small that you can't really read the other information. So what I tend to do is just uncheck that and then we can actually make the column wider, and when the pivot table refreshes, it won't automatically try and fit it to whatever is in the pivot table. Now let's move over to the totals and filters. So right now I've got my grand total showing, and I have it set to show me grand totals for rows as well as for columns. So you can see that it's showing me in the pivot table the grand total for all of the distance driven. Because I'm only looking at just the devices and the total distance, I'm not looking at the other grand total because there really isn't anything else to grand total, if that makes sense. You can choose to hide those if you want just by unchecking them, and you won't see grand totals anymore in there. I'm going to keep them right now just for the sake of this training. The main part that you want to actually take a look at is the display tab. So you do have the option to show expand or collapse buttons. So it's just a plus sign or a minus sign. Now some people may want to use this if they're looking at a large set of data and maybe they're grouping it by date, and they want to be able to just simply expand or subtract a date to easily take a look at the data. Actually, I'll turn it on just to show you what it looks like visually. The other thing that I have checked off here is classic pivot table. So the classic pivot table layout allows you to drag fields on the grid. So I don't know if you saw when I first created the pivot table, it said to drop fields within there. So that's because I have the classic pivot table layout turned on. I can turn that off if I don't want to build my pivot tables that way. And then the other thing is the values row. So it's right now saying it's showing the values row. And what that's doing is what I was showing here, where it's saying total, but then it's also giving it a row of its own for the value name. So if I actually take that off, then what will happen is this word total will now be replaced with the actual name of the value, which is total distance driven, and it will only be one row instead of two rows that we see here for the header. The final thing that I look at is the data tab. Now by default, with the pivot tables that are built into our reports, we have this third option already checked, and that's to refresh the data when opening the file. If you're creating your own pivot table, this will not automatically be selected. And if you are building your report for the MyGeotab system and you wanted to refresh whenever it runs, you definitely want to make sure that that is checked. So a pivot table has what's called a pivot table cache. What it'll do is if you don't set it to refresh, it will hold on to the existing information that was in there when the report was built. So I've had times where a customer will come up and say, you know, I created this report, I put it up on the dashboard, but it's not updating. I'm not seeing any new information on there. It's still just the old template information. And I'd say about 99.99% of the time, it's going to be because this option is not checked. So it's still holding on to the pivot cache, and it hasn't refreshed based on the data that it's being built from, the All Data tab. So if they were to actually open the report, the Data and the Report tab will have the new information, but the pivot table still has the old information. So you definitely want to make sure that that is an option that is checked, or else you will run into that issue. The final thing here is the number of items to retain per field. So basically what this means is in the drop-down of items, so if I were to click on device drop-down, it'll give me the list of the vehicles, so vehicle 1, 2, and 3. If I keep this at automatic, whenever I run this report again, it's going to keep that vehicle 1, 2, and 3 in the list, even if those vehicles aren't in the data anymore. It's still going to keep them in there. Now there's times where this can be useful if you're building a report maybe based on true or false values. You want to make sure that it's always looking at the true value, you're filtering by the true value, and if when you run the report again, it doesn't actually have true values, you still have in your list to choose from, so it'll still work and the report won't break, if you will. You can set it to none. There have been times where I've seen, you know, maybe you've built a report for a customer based on you know, I've built a report based on our internal information, and then I import it into another database and I forgot to set it to none, it'll still have all the previous vehicle information in there. So you got to be really careful about that, especially for the resellers out there. If you're creating reports for different customers, you want to make sure that this is set to none, or else it will still hold on to that previous information. So there are some privacy issues there. So I'm just going to click on OK, and you'll see the pivot table will change like I mentioned. And now you can see I've got just my one row, and I've got my total distance driven here. And if I expand my column, I can now see my dates and everything. And if I were to refresh the pivot table, so if I just right-click and click on Refresh, what would have happened before with that auto-fit option is the column would have shrunk to the data in there. But if I click on Refresh, it keeps it at the size that I've set it to. Now, before I continue, are there any questions out there?
Actually, we have one, the all data field. Kind of elaborate on that. Where does it come from, and is it always there?
That's a good question. So it does come from Geotab. So we have built that into every single template report. So there's no need to recreate it. And what it does is it just highlights all of the data on the report tab. No matter what, if the data grows or shrinks, it's always going to highlight just the data in there. And I've touched on this before. If you were to create a new column on the report tab, and you were to, let's say, add something to the end of the data range that as you see it now, let's say, I don't know, just say count or something. I'm just going to count the rows. Let's say I do that and just fill it down. It's actually not inside of the all data named range. So if I go back up to the name box and click on all data, if I scroll over, you can see it's not including that new column that I've entered in there. So anytime you want to create anything on the report tab, any new columns to calculate anything, add some formulas in there, you want to actually add it inside of the existing name range. Now you can edit the all data named range. So I'll show you if I were to actually, let me just undo, keep that count in there. I can click on formulas at the top and then name manager. So you can see it has the existing all data name, and it's looking at columns A to O, but I've added something in column P. So I can actually just click on that, delete O, and change it to P. Click on the check mark to say that that's what I'm saving it as. Click on close, and now I can double check. Click on all data, and now it's highlighting all the way over to the new column. So that is something you can do. It's just a lot easier to just create a column inside of the already existing data. So yes, it is something that Geotab has built into every report, and the reason is for what I mentioned before. The pivot tables are built from that. It's always going to include all of the data. I hope that answers the question.
It does. Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I touched on the regions here a little bit. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create a report here, and then I'm going to create a chart from that report, or from that pivot table. So I'm just going to take off the distance driven, and this is an exceptions detailed report. So I've got my vehicles, I've got the rule that they broke, where they broke it, the date and time that they broke it, the duration, the distance, and any details surrounding that exception. So we've got one line per exception for each vehicle. So what I want to do here is we do have an exception summary report, which will just give you an incident count of the rules that were broken. I can do the same thing with this report and still have the ability to look back on the report tab to see the details of where it occurred, how long they broke it for, and so forth. And I can do that with the pivot table. So I've got my device already chosen from my list here. And what I want to do is look at the rules. So if I just click on the checkbox for rule, it's going to automatically put it down into the rows section. So you can see I've got my vehicles and I've got my rules, and it's already trying to subtotal even though I don't have any values yet. Now, to get the incident count, it's not an option to choose from in any of these columns here, and the reason being is because you have one exception per line. So each row is essentially an incident count. So you can actually count anything in the report tab. So I could count the location column. So it's just going to give me how many rows there are relating to harsh cornering for vehicle 1. I could also, if I wanted to, insert a column here, and I did touch on that count one. I don't know if it's still there. No, okay. I could just have a count column and just number 1, and I can just fill it down, and I could use that as well as my incident count. Either way will work, and I'll show you what I mean. So I'm just going to refresh the pivot table because I've added a column into the report tab, but it's not actually showing here yet. And you saw that I actually inserted it beside location, and you can see it's not there. So because it's still holding onto the cache until I refresh it. So I can right-click on the pivot table, click on refresh. I now have my count as an option, so I can select that, and it will move it over to the values section. So it automatically summed it. So, and we can validate this just by looking back at the report tab just to show you how it worked. So for vehicle 1 and harsh cornering, we're saying that we saw that exception come through 5 times. So I can go over to the report tab. I can filter by vehicle 1, and I can filter by harsh cornering only. And it looks like 5 times, and I've got a count of 5 times. So that is our incident count. Now that was using the count column, but I can also, if I just take off count, I can actually click on location. I'm not going to click on the checkbox. I'm actually just going to click and drag it down to the values, and it's doing a count of location, and you can see it's giving me the exact same result. So it's just really telling me how many times we saw harsh cornering, how many rows there were, essentially. Now, this looks good. I can see for vehicle 1, these are the rules that they broke, and this is how many times they broke it. Now, let's say a customer, you want to actually throw this up and turn this into a graph because we want to put this on the dashboard. So I'm actually going to change the name of sum of count, and I'm going to call it incident count. So I can click over here and do value field settings, but I can also click on it up here. If I right-click, I can do value field settings over here as well. So 2 different spots that I can do it. And I'm just going to change the name to incident count. And click OK. Make my column a little bit bigger there. Okay, so from here, I can insert a chart. So I'm just going to click on Insert. And I've got a whole bunch of charts here that I can choose from. I'll just choose a standard column chart, pretty straightforward. Let me just make this big so you can see it. Okay. Don't really like the look of it. You can see it's got vehicle 1, vehicle 2, vehicle 3, but then it also shows me harsh acceleration, cornering, idling seatbelt for each. I can change the way it looks now if I want to. Now, one of the things that I wanted to show you as far as the regions go is that you can see that the names of them change when I click on the chart. So if I click on the pivot table, it says filters, columns, rows, and values. And if I click on the chart, it says filters, legend, series, axis, the categories, and the values. So it gives you an idea of what these columns and rows relate to in the actual chart itself. So let's say I want the rule to actually be the legend. I want it to actually be something a little bit different here. So I can click and drag the rule up to legend. And you can see what it's done is it's actually put them in the legend, and it's assigned colors to them, and it makes it visually a lot easier to read. So you can see vehicle 3 only broke the idling rule, and it broke it 2 times. Now from here, we've got some buttons on the chart which you can use. I tend to just get rid of those. You can keep them if you want. They will show in my GeoTab on the dashboard, just so you're aware. You don't really need them because when you open the report, you'll be able to do all the filtering from that these buttons are doing. You can do them on the pivot table itself. So what I tend to do is we've now got pivot chart tools. We can go to Analyze, and we can just click on field buttons and just turn them off. And from here, we can now move the legend if we want to. Maybe I want it to show at the top and give the chart some more room to actually fill in. I can actually put some data labels on there so you actually know what the numbers are, and we can move those labels around. You know, maybe I want it on the inside end, maybe I want it to be in the center or the base, whichever I want. Okay. I can also change the design of the chart. So maybe I don't really like the column chart. I can go to Design, and I can change the chart type. Now I can also do that if I right-click anywhere on the chart. I can go to change chart type there as well. And I can switch it to maybe I want it to be a line one. Nope, that doesn't look too good. Maybe I want it to be a pie chart. No, that doesn't actually make too much sense. Maybe a bar chart. That looks pretty good. I can use that. The other great thing that you can do is you can actually use a combo chart. So there's times where you may want to use this, and we get a little bit more advanced. Let's say you've got the total incident count, but then you want to show the overall average incident count for the entire fleet. You can have the average incident count be a line across all of the columns. So you can have all of your, let's pretend that seatbelt is your average. That would be a line on the chart. And it looks like actually seatbelt isn't being broken that much. So let me choose harsh cornering as the pretend average. Because only a couple of people broke the rule, it tends to look a little funny there. But if you had the overall average for the fleet, it would all be the same number across the board, and it would just be a solid line at some point in the graph. And now you can compare the fleet to the individual vehicles to the average for the entire fleet. And do we have a question?
There is a question on the button that you were just using. Will the buttons work on the dashboard if they want to use it as a filter?
Good question. So the answer is no. Because the dashboard is really just a screenshot of the Excel file, you can't actually do anything with the buttons in my GeoTab. So that's kind of another reason why I don't tend to use them, because it may be confusing to people. It looks like you could interact with them, but you can't actually until you open the Excel file. All right, perfect. So that's pretty much the basics there. I'm not going to go into too much more detail, and we could probably do another session on charts and things we can do with them. There's a lot more that you can do with charts. I definitely recommend playing around. Excel is great, and they actually give you some sample layouts that you could use. You can choose from them if you like the looks of them. I tend to use some of these as well because some of them actually look pretty good and way better than what I could do. So I'll move away from the charts, and what I actually want to talk about is something that I don't tend to use too often, but I wanted to touch on it because I have had to run into it a couple of times. And what that is a calculated field. You can actually build a field within the pivot table that's actually not available in the report tab. So you can create a formula to add up a couple of things and throw it into a pivot table as its own value instead of what we have to choose from. So I'm just going to actually switch over to a trips report. So this is just a detailed trips report for last week, and just a couple of trips per vehicle. What I can actually use this for is maybe I want to look at the average distance. You know, I could simply just grab the distance and do an average, but I wanted to show you how we could actually do it using a calculated field. So if I click over to the report tab, You can see we've got our detailed trip information here, and I've added that count column. So you can see I've inserted a column count, and it's just a number 1 for each row. So this essentially is going to turn into a count of trips, is what I'm going to use it for. So if I head over to the Summary tab, and I'm going to click on the pivot table itself, and under Analyze, I've got the Fields, Items, and Sets button. Now, one of the things I want to touch on with calculated fields is there are some limitations to using these. So the calculated field formulas, they cannot refer to the pivot table totals or subtotals. They also cannot refer to a worksheet cell. So if you were to say equals A1 plus A2, you can't refer to them by that address or by name. And the only function that's available for a calculated field is a sum. But there are ways around that we can try and get an average. And the way around that is by doing what I'm about to do. So I've inserted that column for the count, and I'm going to use that to give me the average. Excel is going to treat it as, it's thinking that it's a sum, but I'm actually building in a formula into the calculated field to give me the average. So if I click on Fields, Items, and Sets, I'm going to go to Calculated Field. There is also Calculated Item, but it's not something that I've maybe used it once. It's not really a common use in Geotab reporting, so I'm not really going to touch too much on that one. But what I want to do is look at Calculated Field. Okay, so I'm going to click on there, and I'm just going to name it. So I'm going to call it Average Distance per Trip. And in the formula, I'm just going to delete that 0. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to grab the existing fields that I have in my list. So what I want to do is I'm going to actually look for my distance. So I've got it here. So equals distance, and I can click on distance and click on Insert Field. I can also double click on it as well. So I'm going to do distance divided by count. I can double click on count, and it will show it in there. Don't worry about any spaces that you may see there. Excel doesn't really worry about that. It's just going to use the formula the way it is. So I'm looking at distance divided by count, and my count is essentially the trips. So it's the distance per trip. So if I click on Add, you can see it now shows up in my field list. So it treats it as though it's a field that was available from the Report tab, but it's actually something that I've created using this formula. So I'm going to click on OK, and it's now added that into my pivot table. So you can see for vehicle 123, Silver 123, the average distance per trip is 15, and this is in kilometers. And it's done that for every vehicle, which is great. So it's saying that it's a sum, but it's not really. If I try and change this to an average, it's going to give me the exact same value. It's because it's actually just using that formula that we've put into the calculated field. So just to validate, make sure that this is working the way that that it's supposed to, let's go over to the Report tab, and I'm going to filter for just that 123 Silver 123. And I always tend to validate the data just to make sure that my calculations are right. I can, I'm assuming a pretty good assumption that this is how it's working, but I always like to just verify just to make sure. So I've chosen my vehicle. You can see we've got trips spanning a couple of days, and I've got my distance. So these 3 trips were 30 kilometers, and I've got one. This one was not even really a trip. It was probably just quick, some idling there, and then one there as well. So if I just highlight all of those, Excel does a great thing, and it gives me some calculations already built in. So the average distance is 15, which is exactly what I saw in the pivot table. So that's a way of getting around that limitation with a calculated field. So there's lots of other use cases for this that I'm sure you can imagine, and maybe some of your minds are already starting to think about what you could do with it. Maybe not, but it's a great way to give you the true average of something instead of maybe an average of an average, depending on what you're looking for. Are there any questions about the calculated fields?
Can you add a qualifier such as distance only over X number of miles?
Yes, I think I understand what the question is. So you maybe only want to do the calculation if the distance is over a certain amount of mileage. Absolutely. So we can actually go back into our calculated field and we can choose the new field that we've got, and we can for sure add an if statement into this. So I can say if, and I can choose my distance again from the list. If distance is greater than maybe, let's say, 2, then I want to do distance over count. Click on modify. Okay. From there, I'd have to actually use filters to filter out the distance. So the trips that had the distance over 2 or whichever. So it's still calculating that, but there's a couple more steps that you have to do to actually to follow through with the whole thing. You'd still have to filter for distance greater than 2 so that it's giving you the true values. But yeah, you can absolutely do some if statements in there. There's lots of different formulas you can use. This is just scratching the surface on what you can do, just a little basic idea. All right, so that kind of covers the basics of calculated fields. Like I mentioned, we may do another session on getting really deep into these and looking at those qualifiers and what else you can do with these calculated fields in relation to some reporting requirements that you may have. All right, so I'm actually going to continue in a very high level look at macros. So macros in Excel are extremely useful in certain situations. A couple of use cases could be, I've run into people that want to pre-sort their report tab when it's run, or they want it to be sorted a certain way when the customer opens up the report. But if you pre-sort your report tab, then everything gets all out of order and it's not actually referencing the right cells on the data tab, and you're going to miss out on data. So what you can do is you can create a macro to actually run when the report is opened, and the macro will sort your report based on your criteria. So I'm just going to head over to, back over to my exceptions details. And let's just imagine that I want it to sort by rule for some reason. So Excel macros are using Visual Basic, so there is, coding involved, but you can actually learn it by recording a macro, which is the great thing. I'm not a developer. I know some of the code. I took Visual Basic back in school. That was a long time ago, so I'm still kind of learning it all again. But by recording a macro, you can see exactly what you're doing and how it converts into the Visual Basic code. Now this is a little scary for some people, but bear with me here. So I can go to Developer tab. Now some people may not actually have a Developer tab. It's something that you have to add on just by simply going into your options. So if I'm just going to show you, if I go into options and I click on Customize Ribbon, I've got a whole bunch of things here that I can choose from. Here's the main tabs, and what you'll probably see is the developer tab listed without a check mark. You can simply just add it. If it's not over there, then it'll most likely be over on the left-hand side. You can select it and add it into the list so you can actually begin to use it. So the developer tab is where I can record a macro. I also have a shortcut down here to record one as well. And what you're doing when you're recording a macro is you're recording every single click and formula and typing of the keys, and you're recording the code of it, I guess you can say. So you want to be careful when you click on record macro that you're very clear and concise with what you want to record and not just clicking willy-nilly and adjusting things here and there, because it will show up in your code and it'll be really hard to understand. So straightforward, I'm just going to click on record macro. It's going to ask me for the macro name. By default, it's going to say macro 1. Right now, it's saying macro 2. You can give a shortcut to the macro to run it. So maybe I want to run it when I hit Control T or something. You can do that. You don't have to. And it's asking you where you want to store it. I just want it in this workbook. So it's pretty straightforward. You don't really have to do anything except for change the name if you want to. And then I'm just going to click on OK. As soon as I click on OK, it's recording. So I'm going to click on OK. And I'm going to click on the drop-down for rule. It's recording this. I'm going to sort ascending. And then I'm going to stop recording. So you can see it now says stop recording. I'm going to click on stop recording. And now the system has recorded the sort of the rule column. Now to see what it's actually done, I can, on the Developer tab, click on Visual Basic, and it opens up a separate window. Now I've got a couple of workbooks open here, so you want to, if you do have a couple open, just make sure you take a look at the name of the report that you're looking at. So this is the one that I'm actually looking at. It's going to show up as a module. Okay, so I've got a plus sign for a module, and I'm just going to double-click on Module 1. This is what was recorded when I sorted the information. So there is a lot more to learn with macros. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but what it's essentially done is it's saying for the active workbook that I'm in, on the report worksheet, it's first clearing any filter, and then it's now saying, okay, now I'm adding a sort or a filter. And it's choosing the range, which was G9 to G27, and I'm sorting on values, and the order is ascending, and the data option is sort text as numbers. So that's what it's done there. Just by simply clicking on the drop-down, sort ascending to descending, it's filled this all in. Then what it's done is it's saying the action that it's actually taking to sort. So this is the sort action. So we've added the sort that we want to do, and this is the action of it actually sorting. Is there a header? Yes, there is, so we don't want to sort that. Do we care about case sensitivity? No. The orientation is top to bottom, which is the ascending. So you don't always necessarily have to understand this and know exactly how to build this. It's good to just kind of read through it and be like, okay, yeah, okay, so that's sorted like that, okay, that works fine, that's fine. It's built now. So all you did was click on a couple of things and it built it for you. From here, you can actually choose when you want to run this macro. So I'm going to say I want to run this macro whenever it opens. If I go to this workbook and I double click on this workbook, up top here where it says General, I'm going to choose Workbook because I want it to be for this workbook. And then for the declarations, there's a whole bunch of things. So these are basically the triggers of when the macro runs. So I'm going to say Open. Whenever the workbook opens, whenever you open the report, I want to run. I haven't done this in a while. Run macro 2. And it might actually just be a space. And that's it. So whenever you whenever you run the report, when it opens, it's automatically going to sort the report for you. And it's doing it after GeoTab has actually created the report and imported the data. So it won't break the report because it's doing it after the fact. Any questions around macros?
Not really. I think it probably gives everyone a good sample of what a macro looks like and how it can be run. I have to tell you, if Angie was talking about how long ago she took Visual Basic, trust me, it was twice as long that I took it. It is something that you can dig into, but it will take a little bit to get there. Angie's given you a great sample of what it can do, and if you really need to dig into it, there's lots of information out there. As Angie said, Google's my best friend. You can get into it that way. That's what I would suggest for that, because it is very individualized for what it is that you want to accomplish for your end result. dig into it very easily the way Angie just did, and then you can kind of go from there. And with that, I'm going to say thank you so much for coming and joining us this week. Thanks. Bye-bye.